Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to continue our discussion of Elizabeth Anderson's really interesting paper, What is the Point of Equality? So this is part 2 of 2. The first video in this series looked at Anderson's critique of a view of equality called luck egalitarianism. And as Anderson tells us, basically the luck egalitarian misses the point. They have a theory of equality, but they don't understand why equality is important and what we really need to focus on in an egalitarian society. So the aim for this video is to get clear on Anderson's notion of democratic equality. So whereas she's arguing against luck egalitarianism, she's going to argue in favor of this view called democratic equality. And after this, she's going to develop the implications of her view. If we want to focus on this thing called democratic equality, it will give us a way of approaching distributive justice, right? These questions about who has what resources, what sorts of inequalities in this society might be acceptable or unacceptable. So what is this debate between the democratic egalitarian versus the luck egalitarian? Well, let's remember where we went last time. Luck egalitarianism is this theory where we have this starting thought that some people are just born luckier than others. Some people are born with no disabilities, some people are born with disabilities. In that way, we might say the former are lucky and the latter are unlucky. And then the function of the state is to create equality of opportunity or resources or expected welfare. And that might mean taking some resources from those who were lucky and giving it to those who are unlucky. And in this way, we might think of it as this balancing act against certain kinds of cosmic injustice. The other thing that the luck egalitarian told us is that we will only compensate people for their undeserved bad luck. And that means that if you can trace a person's misfortune to their voluntary choices, then in that case, this person would no longer be a candidate for reimbursement. So the simple example would be, if you lose your money making a bet or putting your money into bad stocks, well, the state would say that was perhaps not an undeserved misfortune, but a misfortune that you brought on yourself, and therefore it deserves no compensation. But here's the problem with this luck egalitarian view. Anderson says that this view will fail to show respect for citizens. She tells us that the view is paternalistic. Because this distinction that we make between option luck, bad luck that you brought on yourself, and brute luck, bad luck that came about through no choice of your own, ultimately it ends up having to make intrusive judgments about responsibility. Which misfortunes are your fault, and which misfortunes you brought upon yourself, right? Not only that, but it's paternalistic in the way that by treating the state's recompensation as a kind of insurance for having bad brute luck, it will also force some individuals in some cases to buy insurance. It might say, look, you're not prudent enough to buy insurance for yourself. In certain situations, Anderson says, this takes away people's freedom and demeans them in the process. But the further point about option luck is that it disclaims responsibility for helping those who come to need in situations where their voluntary choice is a factor. So think about a person who, say, loses their home due to a hurricane. If you live on the Gulf Coast, or if you live in North Carolina, there is a certain chance that you will lose your home to a hurricane. And you do have the option, in some sense, to move somewhere where that risk is lower. I don't know, maybe Utah, right? But in that case, it would abandon these people. Anderson finds this unacceptable. The further thing that Anderson points out is that luck egalitarian fails to show respect even for those that it compensates, because it will express contemptuous pity. Remember, pity is not just a judgment about how much we should help somebody, but it looks down on a person for being worse off than oneself, right? And in this way, if we were to demean a person, one way we could demean a person would be to say, your state of being is so pitiful that we ought to recompensate you, to bring your state of being up to a level of equal choice worthiness as an able-bodied person, or a good-looking person, or a smart person. We think that those sorts of judgments aren't the sort of judgments that should be made by the state. So that's the luck egalitarian view, and we can also see this concern about disrespect that Anderson is raising. So there has to be a better way, right? Here's Anderson's thought. She says that these luck egalitarians are focusing too much on what we might call these cosmic injustices. It's a cosmic injustice. The universe is done you an injustice if you're born with a disability. It also focuses too much on divisible concrete resources like money or access to particular institutions. We might say that trying to equalize those things leads us to focus on the wrong thing. So here's Anderson's starting gambit. Here's a better way to think about equality. Instead of making sure that people have equal welfare or equal stuff, Anderson says, our starting thought for egalitarianism is that we should be against natural hierarchies. The thought here being that we shouldn't have people who are naturally suited in their natures to rule. So we might think there should be no people who are hereditary kings. We shouldn't have caste systems. And Anderson will even say, even if you are less intelligent than some other people in our society, if you're less good looking, if you're less athletically strong, Anderson will say, even if those things are the case, that doesn't put you in a lower place in the social hierarchy, right? So you don't get to be ruled over by others. And in this way, if we're against hierarchy, what we're really trying to say is that all adults are equal moral agents. It doesn't mean that everybody is equally good. We're not all equally decent. Some of us are better and some of us are worse. That's certainly true. But when we say that we are all equal moral agents, what we are all saying is that we are all people and that we all have a basic package of inalienable rights that we all deserve and that we can never lose. And in this way, we can never be the subject of an inferior position within a hierarchy. So the project for an egalitarian in Anderson's mode of thought is we shouldn't be focused too much on material goods. Our primary concern should be to abolish socially created oppression and live in a society where we all respect one another as equals. So this is what Anderson is calling democratic equality. One helpful start is, instead of thinking about it in terms of equality of goods or even equality of outcomes or even equality of opportunities, Anderson is saying that we should be focused on equality in how we relate to one another as persons. So, in this way that we're getting away from money, resources, divisible goods, or even opportunities, she says, when we live in a society of equals and a true democracy, we accept that we have an obligation to justify our actions by principles acceptable to the other. And in this society, we will take mutual consultations, reciprocation, and recognition for granted. So we might say that in a real democracy, everybody has a say, and everybody deserves basic equal respect, and that we owe it to one another to be accountable for the way that we're affecting one another and the laws that we choose to live amongst one another. So even though Anderson is arguing against Jerry Cohen in parts of the paper, because Jerry Cohen is a certain luck egalitarian, she does like this point from Cohen that when we're thinking about democratic justification for policies, what we're trying to do is look for and give reasons for our policies that serve as reasons for everybody affected. And in this way, we're searching for reasons that meet the standard of what Cohen and then Anderson will call the test of interpersonal justification. So just thinking back, and we can already start to apply this to ways that the luck egalitarian approach gets cashed out. The luck egalitarian would say something like, look, if a person irresponsibly drives, if they get drunk and then make an illegal turn and cause a crash, luck egalitarianism says, well, maybe we should, once we confirm that this person has acted irresponsibly, we should remove any life support that this person might have. But we might say, interpersonally justifying that sort of approach would be unacceptable. That sort of reason isn't a reason that we could all buy into. And in this way, it would fail to respect that we are living in a society of equals. So here's an important point for Anderson. She says that many philosophers, if you look at somebody like Robert Nozick, they're going to say, look, there are two values, freedom and equality. If you want freedom, then everybody gets to do as they please, and they won't be constrained, and there won't be government interference. And on the other hand, we might have something like equality, right? Getting people to an equal level of resources. But Anderson points out that once we think about equality not in terms of everybody having the same share of resources, we think that actually freedom and equality are not in conflict with one another. Because when we have equal respect for persons, we will be in a society where individuals are not oppressed, right? So in a society with true equality, nobody gets oppressed, and that's another way into freedom. So this is a way around one of the big tensions within political philosophy, as Anderson sees it. She can further cash this out by appealing to a way of thinking about justice called the capabilities approach, which emerges from the thinking of a philosopher named Amartya Sen. And here's Sen's basic idea. There are certain states of beings that we could call functionings, right? So to function, you might think about all the things in your life that bring flourishing to you, right? It might be to participate in a community, to go to church, to exercise and move your body, to be involved in loving romantic relationships. These are all things that make a life go good. They are your functionings. And we could figure out a list, and we could work on this in consultation with one another in society. And it might be something like this. You need things like health, nourishment, participation in community, and developing your talents. And when you get to do these things, you are living a full human life. So that's a good life. Think back to Aristotle, right? The state begins in order for us to live, but it stays in existence in order for us to live well. For Sen, building off that approach, we'll say that it's like health, nourishment, participation in community, development of your talents, and so forth that make a good life. And then here's the point. The state's job, justice, is a matter of enabling people. That is, you give them capabilities to pursue the states and achievements that constitute well-being. So in a just state, you will be given access to things like good healthcare, decent food, participation in things like your church or other valuable groups. And you'll be given an opportunity to develop your talents. Now, this might even point out that part of how you help a person develop their talents is to get them a good education. So we can already see that providing a person with a good education is a capability that the state will protect in order to enable you to pursue certain functionings. Now, here's a valuable point that Anderson draws out of this, which is important for the question of distributive justice. Not all of your capabilities have to be promoted and protected by the state, right? So the thought is, the state might be required to make sure that you are provided with decent, dignified shelter and food, right? She suggests that, like, to be in a situation where you have no private space and you are without a home of your own, this makes it harder for you to function as an equal in society. But some people might want other functionings. They want to become a really good card player. They want to get really good at poker. Well, does the state require you to fund poker lessons for other people? Well, Anderson is going to say no, because being a good card player is not a necessary feature of functioning well in a society, right? And we would think about it as, we want to think about civil society. This is the space in which you are functioning as an equal with others. Now, this point can help us to understand some of the harder questions that we were posing for the luck egalitarian. So, not giving you a capability for a gourmet diet. Right? If you have really expensive taste and you can only be happy if you're drinking champagne and eating foie gras, the fact that the state isn't providing you with champagne and foie gras doesn't leave you oppressed. It doesn't prevent you from functioning as an equal in society. But if we fail to provide a person with a ramp into City Hall such that they can take their wheelchair into City Hall and then speak up about their displeasure about a new potential law, we would say that that sort of resource is necessary for one's functioning in civil society, where in civil society we're talking about not just being able to speak up within a democracy, but it's also all these public spaces, whether it be parks or businesses or education. You need to function as an equal within civil society. This is one of the key capabilities that we need to give a person in order to live well. You don't actually need a gourmet diet in order to live well. This is an important distinction for Anderson. Because when we're thinking about civil society, we're thinking about that sphere of social life that's meant to be open to all, and which goes beyond the state bureaucracy. So we could think about parks, hospitals, businesses, and so forth. Anderson helpfully points out that when you think about the civil rights movement of the 1960s, this was largely about getting all people access to civil society. So think about the fact that one of the big debates within the civil rights movement, or one of the big requests of the civil rights movement, was that schools not be segregated by race, right? Because in order to have a truly functioning civil society, you need all universities, especially public universities, to be open to all. Or, I teach at UNC Greensboro. One of the great historical moments in the civil rights movement was the Greensboro sit-in at the Woolworth's lunch counter. And we might even think that being able to sit at Woolworth's and have lunch is an important way of being respected as an equal within society. We might think that ultimately this test of interpersonal justification would fail if we tried to create a policy that excluded people on the basis of race from entering this one part of civil society. Now, here's the next step that Anderson's going to take, and this is going to help us understand, well, even though we're thinking about respecting one another as equals in society, this will have implications for distributive justice. Not only will you be given access to things like school and decent housing and decent clothing and decent food, right? We could also say that part of participation in civil society is participation in the economy, right? The world of business, the world of production is something that we should leave open to each. So remember that our fundamental concern is that we show equal respect for one another, right? Now, as Anderson is putting this, that's our main concern. And then when we start to think about who deserves what goods and when, she's going to say that these distributions are going to be not fundamental, but a secondary concern insofar as certain distributions of goods within our society are going to be instrumentally valuable. That is, not useful in themselves, but useful for getting the main important good thing, right? So there's an instrumental value to distributing goods and resources. And again, we want to make sure that everybody can function as an equal in society. So think about a society where we have extreme inequality, where some people are very, very rich, but at the same time, some people don't have access to basic nutrition or basic housing, and in this situation become vulnerable to the whims and sometimes contempt of others. Anderson says this, when you become unfree and subordinated in a society, well, becomes a situation in which one way this can happen is property is so unequally distributed that some adults will live in abject dependence on others and live at the mercy of them. And she's going to say that if you create outcasts and subordinate classes, she goes pretty far here. She says that can be as repressive as any despotic regime. So in a case where, say, an employer rules over an employee and can make them do anything because that employee knows that they would starve, well, that would be one of these hierarchies that democratic equality asks us to abolish. She further points out, when we think about what our economy is, she's going to say it is a system of cooperative joint production. We even notice this in Plato. Part of how we have a functioning society is that different people have different specializations, do different jobs, and even for Plato, our irrational working class is a necessary part of society and makes it possible for the philosopher kings to be philosophical, right? So in this way, we think that our economy is a system of cooperative joint production. Each of our work depends on what everyone else is doing. So I really love the fact that I get to be a lecturer of philosophy. I get to teach philosophy for a living. But that means that I don't put my talents into other things. I don't build houses for other people. I don't make sure that the roads are clean and safe and functioning. I don't make sure that all the technology in my classrooms is up and running. I don't make sure that something like YouTube is functioning. I depend on other people to do that. So we could think, about how what we are doing and our work is highly dependent on the work, contribution, and labor of other people. We recalled last time that one of Anderson's concerns about luck egalitarianism is that it said, look, some people will choose to be lumberjacks, and they will come to hardship as a result of those choices. Anderson says, it is unconscionable that the luck egalitarian would say that a person deserves no compensation from the rest of society when a lumberjack becomes injured. Because we are all depending on and we are all mutually enacting that somebody go and be a lumberjack, right? We need lumberjacks because we need lumber in this world. We need to build more houses, after all, right? And in this way, we can't disclaim responsibility for people who come to harm when they do dangerous jobs. We need somebody to do those dangerous jobs. And as a society, this cooperative practice of joint production, we don't abandon people when they come to harm in doing their job. Now, Anderson will say, in her view, access to the economy doesn't mean free goods. Now, she will say, on the theory of the capabilities approach, justice is a matter of giving everybody access to the economy, but it doesn't mean that we are going to give everybody access to achievements or resources that come from, working with your capabilities. To the extent that the capabilities approach is focused on functionings, it also acknowledges that some people will be given a capability and that person will squander their capability. They will be given a good education and this person won't bother to learn or won't bother to apply their talents. Well, we don't owe it to that person to give them the exact same level of resources as somebody who's put in the effort. And Anderson puts it, she is willing to say that the right to certain goods could be conditional on working for others. And you might say, well, that's a little bit harsh, we might think that Anderson is thinking. But here's how she puts it. She says that every right that you have, right, brings obligations for others, right? Sometimes you'll hear people say, with every right comes a responsibility. And sometimes I've heard people say this in ways that say that, well, you lose your rights if you don't act responsibly. Anderson thinks that that's not the right way to go. There are certain rights that you can never lose. But there is a more philosophically defensible way of saying with each right comes a responsibility, and it's this. If I have a right not to be killed, you have a responsibility not to kill me, right? And in this way, we say every time one individual has a right, that will have a correlative responsibility and duty for other people, right? So think about the fact that we said a person has a right not to be so vulnerable as they might be in a situation where they are completely homeless or completely vulnerable in terms of the resources that they have. Well, in that case, that means that there is a responsibility for others to provide for that person. There's an obligation, a duty to provide for others, right? And in this way, if a person needs certain means to function as an equal, it will also mean that others will have a responsibility and a duty to produce those goods and provide them for those in need. And even though this theory of democratic equality treats certain material goods as instrumentally important for a society being just, they are still ultimately very important. The necessary means for creating a society of equals has to be pursued. And this is the way in which Anderson is going to say we will still have responsibilities to provide for others. And this will give us a robust approach to distributive justice. A couple of points to finish on. Here's another way in which luck egalitarianism fails, but the approach of democratic equality, especially as it's filled in by the capabilities approach, will not fail. Remember, when we looked at luck egalitarianism, it said things like this. We want to even out the bad luck in such a way that everybody would be equally happy with their starting point, that nobody would envy anybody else's starting position. Well, this is a way of thinking about distributions of goods based on subjective preferences. But Anderson thinks that it would be a mistake to use subjective preferences as our guide for distributive justice. Anderson borrows a helpful point from T.M. Scanlon, another notable moral and political philosopher. And Scanlon made this point: you might care more subjectively about society to help you build a temple, maybe for your expensive religious ceremonies that you care about deeply, and you might want a subsidy for your temple instead of a subsidy for food. In spite of that preference, it doesn't mean you have more of a right to the temple subsidy than food. And in this way, Scanlon tells us, and Anderson agrees, that what people want isn't necessarily what we're obligated to provide for them. And in this way, your freedom to not achieve your capabilities, a person could say, acknowledge that the state will provide them with food. It is your right to not take that provision. But yet, even though you have a right not to take the goods that the state owes to you, doesn't mean that you are then absolved of having to provide those goods to others. Remember, if everybody has a right to a basic standard of living, then that means that others in society capable of getting them there have a responsibility to do just that. Here's a further way of looking at this point about how democratic equality is based on objective states of well-being and objective states of non-oppression. Think about the case of disability rights. We shouldn't think about what we owe to disabled people in terms of subjective hardships. Instead, we should think about what an unjust disadvantage is, what counts as unjust exclusion, and we might even think whether not having a preference satisfied really counts as oppression. Right? And here's how Anderson thinks about it. We are not required to give disabled people funds to bring their levels of happiness up to a level of happiness that their bad luck denied them. In fact, if you ask disabled people about their satisfaction with life, so a blind person is just as satisfied with their life often as a sighted person. Right? Now, sometimes when people lose their sight midway through life, they might be very depressed and very frustrated in those early months and years. But it's also been found that people's level of happiness eventually evens out. Now, what should the theory of democratic equality say about this? Well, we would say that even if a person's level of happiness has evened out, don't focus on their subjective preferences so much. Instead, we should think about the question of what goods will this person need in order to function as an included member of society? And we might say this: look, even if a blind person is just as happy as a sighted person, we should make sure to provide assistive resources such that they can learn about what laws are being passed, that they can take public transit, that they can function within our education system. And in this way, the luck egalitarian approach won't focus so much on subjective preferences, but instead it will think about what we provide for a person to include them in society, right? And here again, we can notice that this moving away from subjective preferences and towards objective features of what we would count as oppression explains why you are not oppressed when you're not given a subsidy to pay for your expensive taste, your taste for foie gras and champagne. But we wouldn't want to think about your desire to have a say at City Hall is some sort of expensive taste. Instead, it's just the necessary means to functioning as an equal in society. And that's an important distinction that Anderson is going to make between her view and the Luck egalitarian view. Just some final points. Some people might say, well, isn't this sort of welfare state the kind of thing that will let people be irresponsible, knowing that the government will never let them fall into a state of complete destitution? Well, Anderson will say, democratic equality can still promote personal responsibility because it's just about making sure you have enough, right? It's not about making everybody equal in terms of the material goods and levels of happiness that they have. It's about giving people enough to function as an equal. But of course, you have plenty of incentive to work for and protect goods beyond what's just enough, right? So if you really want champagne and foie gras, you can work for money. You can save your money, and you can find opportunities to pursue that desire, right? So in this way, there's still plenty of reason to be prudent. A helpful example of further prudence that Anderson thinks is helpful and illustrative is her example that the democratic egalitarian, her theory of democratic equality, will be okay with a tax on cigarettes ex ante. That is, we could add $2 or $3 or $4 to the price of cigarettes, which then gets put into the public healthcare system, which then is used to alleviate the burdens created on the public healthcare system by people who have chosen to smoke and who then eventually get various problems like emphysema or lung cancer, right? But remember how the Luck egalitarian would approach this issue. They might say, if you are a person who chooses to smoke and gets cancer, well then that misfortune is on you and it's not on society, and as such, we might deny a person treatment for their cancer or an oxygen tank to help them with their emphysema. That sort of thing would fail to treat the person with respect, it would abandon them, and it would even treat them as a certain subordinate person within society. So in this way, we would have disrespect with an ex post denial of healthcare, but an ex ante tax gives a person a choice to smoke or not smoke without abandoning them. Final point. Anderson points out that the Luck egalitarians have given us some strange cases, compensating people for their preference for champagne over still water, giving a person, say, an income just so that they can go and surf and be a beach bum. There aren't actually movements of people saying, all I want to do is surf, and the government owes it to me to make that choice. When we look at actual egalitarian movements, Anderson noticed movements trying to defend things like disability rights, gay rights, and equality for women as equals in society. That's the big aim of feminism. And in this way, the approach of democratic equality actually speaks to the real concerns of active egalitarian movements rather than these weird philosophical hypotheticals that philosophers like Cohen and Arneson and Van Parijs have been focusing on. But in this way, Anderson says, we can focus on respecting one another as equals, and if we make that our concern, we will get a robust theory of distributive justice, but it won't make the same sorts of mistakes as we do when we miss the point of equality, as the Luck egalitarians did, according to Anderson. So that's going to conclude my discussion. I hope you found this an illuminating look into Anderson's alternative approach to distributive justice. And as always, if you have any questions or thoughts, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Thanks for listening, and take care.